we're looking at a premise that is so provocative, it might just redefine how you look at one of humanity's oldest and most enduring institutions,
Religion.
religion. But we are treating it as a competitive market.
Our mission today is to analyze what we're calling the divine economy. We're going to explore how religious organizations function not just as, spiritual or ethical centers, but as highly sophisticated, competitive organizational models.
Like platforms.
Exactly. Platforms, if you will,
Yeah.
constantly vying for people, for wealth, and for influence.
Mm.
We're really challenging the assumption that faith somehow exists outside the constraints of, economic and organizational strategy.
And I find this premise so challenging because I think we're culturally programmed to see faith as something separate, something above the transactional world of economics.
Right.
But if you strip away the theology and the morality, what you're left with is this highly effective, very complex organization that has to continuously persuade you to join.
And then persuade you to stay.
Right. And persuade you to invest your most valuable assets.
Yeah.
Your time, your money, your personal energy. It's a huge ask.
Precisely. The core thesis we're pursuing today is that religious movements gain power through, really, an organizational genius for persuading individuals to join and commit. And that legitimacy, that ability to move multitudes and command loyalty, that is something political leaders have always sought to harness, and frankly, they often envy it.
So our goal today is to understand the competitive strategies, the organizational innovations, and sometimes the inherent vulnerabilities that have been developed by the world's most successful religious organizations over millennia.
Exactly.
And crucially, this strategic partnership between faith and, let's call it, economic incentive. This isn't some modern, MBA invention.
Oh, not at all. This is an age-old dynamic. Our sources bring us right back to the mid-18th century, referencing the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith.
The Adam Smith.
That's right. When we think of Adam Smith, we usually think of the invisible hand and the wealth of nations. But Smith was a really keen observer of organizational dynamics, including religious ones.
Okay.
He began compiling his great work around 1764 while he was traveling in Toulouse in southwest France. And he was just deeply affected by the atmosphere of sectarian strife that was still incredibly raw in that region.
So what was happening in Toulouse specifically that shaped his thinking on church monopolies?
Well, just 2 years earlier, in 1762, there was the notorious, absolutely brutal execution of Jean Calas. Calas was a successful French Protestant merchant. His son was found hanged, and despite very strong evidence pointing to suicide, Calas was arrested. He was falsely accused of murdering his own son to stop him from converting to Catholicism.
So the entire legal system, which was fueled by Catholic intolerance and state backing, just condemned him.
They did.
And the verdict was carried out with extreme public brutality, wasn't it?
It was horrific. Calas was publicly tortured on the rack, refusing to confess. He was then broken on the wheel, where his limbs were shattered in front of a massive public crowd.
Wow.
Finally, he was strangled and his body was burned. The memory of this state-sanctioned religious persecution was just incredibly fresh for Smith.
And Smith saw this violence, this absolute intolerance, as a symptom of something organizational, a failure of market dynamics.
He did. He reflected that if a church, like the Catholic Church in 18th century France, is legally protected, enjoys a monopoly, and is entitled by the state to coerce people, to break them and kill them if they disagree, it loses all incentive to do the hard work.
The hard work of being persuasive.
Exactly, of making its teaching spiritually compelling or organizationally accountable. The economic environment directly shapes the content of the message. Monopolies, he saw, breed theological laziness and a reliance on brute force.
That sets a crucial benchmark for our entire deep dive then. The level of competition directly correlates with the organizational quality and the necessity of persuasion. So if we're going to discuss this as a competitive landscape, we need to start with a working definition. What exactly is religion, organizationally speaking?
Well, from the source material, we can define religion broadly as a diverse set of activities centered on people's interaction with invisible spirits, whether that's one or many.
Okay.
And these spirits are believed to intervene causally in the world, influencing human life for good or ill. And they can, crucially, be influenced by human appeal, by ritual, or by prayer.
And the sources use that fantastic term, enchantment, to describe the core experience.
Exactly. Enchantment is that sense that the world contains such spirits, that the mundane world isn't silent or purely material, but that there is an active presence aware of what we do. And this sense of enchantment creates the fundamental demand curve for all religious platforms.
Historically, these organizations haven't all looked the same. Our sources draw a vital distinction between two broad organizational types that have dominated the last few millennia.
We call them the two faces of faith. First, you have what are called immanent religions.
Immanent?
Okay, these are typically local, frequent, and often very transactional. The interaction with spirits is immediate, and it's intended to offer cures in the here and now. You can think of the polytheistic systems of classical antiquity or many indigenous faiths.
So like ancient Greece or Rome,
Mhm.
where you had a vast pantheon of gods. If you needed help winning a battle, you appealed to Mars.
Right.
If you needed a good harvest, you went to Ceres. There was a deity for every niche. I think even for the Roman sewers, Venus Cloacina.
Precisely. It was a market of localized spiritual entrepreneurs selling specific immediate services. Authority was often very decentralized, tied to local temples or specific oracles.
Right, so if you wanted philosophical meaning, you went to a philosopher.
Exactly. The priest was focused on practical, immediate intervention.
So it sounds like a really fragmented market.
It was. But then, a major organizational innovation emerged, particularly during what we call the Axial Age. And this gave rise to the transcendental religions.
Things like Buddhism, Christianity, Islam.
Those are the big three. They're more global in scope, often monotheistic or focused on a unified cosmic principle, and critically, they offer these comprehensive narratives of individual salvation.
So they're speaking directly to suffering, to hardship, the meaning of life and death. A unified vision.
Yes, a unified vision of the individual's place in the vast cosmos. They were essentially the global brands, centralizing that fragmented local market under a single, comprehensive narrative.
Which would have required a profound shift in organizational strategy. You're moving from serving local, immediate needs to selling a long-term, comprehensive product.
A product called Salvation or Enlightenment, and that allowed them to cross political and geographic boundaries with just unprecedented scale.
Okay, this historical analysis brings us to the elephant in the room, the secularization myth. For decades, the dominant narrative in the West has been that modernity, science, prosperity. It all inevitably leads to the decline and death of religion.
Right.
Does the global data actually support this premise?
Globally, the premise is definitively refuted by our sources. The secularization narrative gained traction largely because the focus, especially in Western academia and media, was heavily skewed
Skewed where?
towards specific data points in highly secularized regions like Western Europe, which are, demographic outliers. But if you zoom out and look at the whole world, religion is not in terminal decline. It is powerfully adaptive.
So let's look at the hard numbers, because they stretch back over a century and they really challenge this assumption.
Okay, if we look at global census data from 1900 to 2020, the self-professed share of Christians did fall slightly, from about 34.5% in 1900 to 32.2% in 2020.
Which on the surface looks like a decline.
It does. But this superficial decline is deeply misleading. Christianity was historically concentrated in Europe and the Americas, which experienced relatively slow population growth compared to the global average.
So if the religious distribution had just stayed static, Christianity's share would have fallen way more sharply just due to demographics alone.
Exactly. The fact is, Christianity actually attracted 6 percentage points more adherents than demographic trends would have predicted.
So it's successfully expanding.
It's expanding into fast-growing regions, like sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and overcoming its slow demographic base. It's growing, just not as fast as some other regions' populations.
And the growth of Islam provides a really sharp contrast here.
It really does. Islam provides perhaps the strongest counter-evidence to the secularization myth. It nearly doubled its global share over that same period, rising from 12% in 1900 to an estimated 24% in 2020.
Wow.
It attracted about 5 percentage points more adherents than demographic divergence predicted. This represents phenomenal competitive growth in the modern era.
What about non-believers? The atheists and agnostics often presented as the inevitable intellectual byproduct of scientific progress.
Their story is maybe the most surprising in the data. The recorded share of atheists and agnostics was 0 in 1900, simply because censuses didn't even track it.
Right?
But once they started, that global share peaked at 19% in 1970.
That 1970 peak is really interesting. Was that really a reflection of global intellectual enlightenment?
Crucially, no. Our sources emphasize that the majority of that 1970 rise owed far more to the political project of centralized, forceful atheism.
Imposed by massive authoritarian regimes.
Specifically, the Soviet Union under Stalin and China under Mao Zedong. It had very little to do with philosophical or scientific conversions.
So atheism in its peak global form was essentially a state policy.
A coercive state policy.
Right.
And the moment those regimes began to crumble or soften since 1970, the global share of atheists and agnostics has been in continuous decline. It's dropped to an estimated 12% in 2020.
Which indicates that individual religious conviction is highly resilient.
And that forceful secularization projects are organizationally unsustainable in the long run.
It seems then that when decline does occur, particularly in places like the US, Spain, or Ireland, it's not the unavoidable end of history. It's usually a specific local organizational failure.
Yes. The sources suggest that where religious participation falls off a cliff, it is almost always tied to the religious organization being profoundly discredited.
Often by scandals.
Or by becoming overly politicized and partisan, which shrinks its natural catchment area and alienates potential followers. It's a failure of accountability and strategy, not simply the unstoppable march of modernity.
Okay, let's use that link between competition and organizational quality to transition back to Adam Smith's insight. How did competition force improvement in 18th century England?
Smith was fascinated by the rapid growth of the new dissenters, particularly the Methodists led by John Wesley.
Right.
These Methodists were accused by the established Church of England of emotional manipulation, of making people go mad and bewitching their listeners with these fervent outdoor sermons.
The Methodists were basically the disruptive startup in the spiritual marketplace.
They absolutely were. And Smith contrasted their intense, persuasive, emotional appeal with the established clergy of the Church of England. He described the Anglican priests as, quote, men of learning and elegance, who possess all the virtues of gentlemen.
Respectable, well-educated, secure in their positions.
But, Smith noted, they were terrible at filling the pews and engaging their parishioners.
They were complacent because they enjoyed that political monopoly, just like the Catholic Church in France. The Methodists, though, they had to fight for every soul.
The Methodists had to be persuasive because they had zero legal protection and operated in a highly competitive environment. This is why Smith concluded that a church protected by law monopoly loses the incentive to do the hard work of persuasion.
Which leads to lethargy and eventually a reliance on coercion if its power is absolute.
Yes. Competition, Smith argued, keeps religion persuasive, accountable, and dynamic.
This is the perfect moment to introduce the modern concept that structures this entire deep dive, the platform model. We usually apply this term to digital giants, Amazon, Google, Facebook. How does religion fit that definition?
A platform is, structurally, an institution that facilitates relationships and then appropriates value from those relationships. Religious movements are, in essence, non-digital platforms.
And they're successful because they provide shared meaning and social benefits, not abstractly, but through the intense, deliberate creation of communities.
Exactly. And the key organizational insight here, differentiating it from, say, a simple club membership, is that the members aren't just consumers of a collective benefit. They are organizational assets.
Assets, what do you mean by that?
Well, members are not just receiving a sermon or a ritual. They are actively delivering benefits, emotional, social, and sometimes material to each other.
Oh, I see.
Think of the analogy of a high-end nightclub. The club doesn't make money from everyone equally. It uses lower prices or free entry for certain high-value assets, like women in the traditional model, because their presence increases the willingness of other members to pay high prices.
So the quality of the platform is dependent on the assets engaging with one another.
Exactly. In a religious context, the platform determines the terms under which individuals can participate, which directly impacts the quality and stability of the relationships that are formed inside it.
But how do these platforms manage pricing and commitment for their members, especially when they ask for something like a uniform tithe?
Even the traditional tithing system, which requires 1/10 of your income, is far more sophisticated than just a flat fee. First, it's inherently progressive. Richer members pay more than poorer members.
Okay.
Second, and this is critical for long-term adherence, the pressure applied by religious leaders is highly sensitive to individual circumstances.
Sensitive how? It's not just a spreadsheet calculation.
No, not at all. If a member is suffering from a job loss, a family illness, or some other severe difficulty, the pressure to pay the tithe is often quietly relaxed or even temporarily waived.
So the platform differentiates the pressure.
It demonstrates organizational empathy and maintains the members' loyalty during a period of stress. If they insisted on payment during a crisis, They would lose the asset entirely.
So the platform optimizes for long-term commitment, not just short-term cash flow. And they also highly reward non-monetary contributions.
Absolutely. The platform model predicts that organizations will reward non-monetary commitments, time, energy, organizational skills, leadership in youth groups, from those who contribute best to the community's functioning.
And these non-monetary commitments reinforce the very structure of the community.
They deepen the ties and make the platform more valuable for everyone.
That deep reinforcement leads to what economists call the lock-in effect. Once a successful religious platform creates this intense community, that social lock-in gives the organization enormous power.
That lock-in is the organizational key to success. Organizations like megachurches or established powerful denominations accumulate vast wealth, real estate, and capital, not because their doctrine is inherently superior, but because their strong community ties are incredibly difficult and costly to replicate elsewhere.
So leaving the platform isn't just about changing your spiritual beliefs. It means turning your back on your entire support system, your social network, your identity. That's a powerful deterrent.
It is. And this resulting freedom from intense competitive pressure gives the organization's leaders relative freedom to pursue diverse motivations beyond just simple, constant growth or profit maximization.
Such as what?
Well, they can engage in massive, costly philanthropy, or they can pursue specific political messaging, or they can simply bask in fame and authority. Or, as Smith noted, they can simply coast along, not exerting themselves to meet the members' evolving needs, knowing that the community ties are strong enough to prevent an exodus.
The lock-in effect ensures stability, but it also reduces accountability. This all brings us to the demand side. If the organization has this power, why do people, particularly the most vulnerable, choose to pay such a high price to belong? We have a remarkable and frankly heartbreaking case study in the sources. The story of Grace, a street hawker in Accra, Ghana.
Grace's story brilliantly encapsulates the emotional economics of the divine economy. She walks up and down the main roads leading into Accra, selling iced water in these small plastic sachets. She works for 12 grueling hours a day, 6 days a week, inhaling exhaust fumes, often earning just over $1.50 in total.
That is labor at the absolute edge of survival.
And despite this minuscule income, she pays her tithes of 10% plus collections, bringing her total contribution to the church up to around 12% of her earnings.
An enormous sacrifice, an almost unthinkable proportion of her income dedicated to an organization that already has significant resources.
It is. And as an outside observer, you might be tempted to wonder by what moral right a rich pastor asks this poor woman to pay so much.
But Grace sees the value proposition differently, doesn't she?
For Grace, the church offers an indispensable refuge from the exhausting awfulness of her daily labor. It's not about the dollar value. It's about the status and the safety.
Oh, so?
When she enters the church, she's greeted with respect. She's wearing a clean dress, not the dusty, exhausted clothes she wears on the street. She's given responsibility. She's an usher, a choir member, and a Sunday school assistant. She's taking responsibility for people perhaps even more vulnerable than herself.
So she's transformed from someone contemptuously ignored on the street to someone of status, importance, and moral worth within a supportive community.
And critically, it's a social exchange platform. She has a chance of finding friends and potentially a reliable husband, the sources emphasize, one who is less likely to drink or to beat her.
So the church community filters for valuable, high-commitment partners. The community provides social mobility and physical safety that the state and the marketplace do not.
Yes, and the high price she pays, that tie that is big enough to hurt, serves as a certification of her commitment.
It's a signal.
Exactly. The esteem she feels and the loyalty she receives in return depends on coming willingly and making a significant donation. If she stops paying, she may feel less welcome. The tithes are the price she pays to certify her belonging, her high-quality membership, and her identity. She is purchasing social capital, safety, and a future.
Beyond this profound community value, there's also evidence that religion functions as a very real form of social insurance against life's inevitable shocks and losses.
There's strong empirical evidence of this competitive relationship between state welfare and church services. Studies show a clear historical correlation. When the U.S. government expanded social spending, for instance, with the launch of the New Deal in the 1930s, it led to a corresponding and substantial decline in church charitable spending.
So the availability of secular government-backed insurance reduces the demand for religious insurance.
Absolutely. And conversely, more religious individuals often express lower preferences for state-offered social insurance because they already have a functioning, community-based safety net. The two services are highly competitive substitutes.
This link between social structure and resilience becomes deeply alarming when you look at current social crises in the U.S.
Our sources highlight the startling increase in what are tragically called deaths of despair, deaths from drug poisoning, suicide, and cirrhosis, specifically among lower-educated, middle-aged white Americans.
Right.
Researchers found that this dramatic increase was preceded by a corresponding significant decline in religious participation among those very same groups.
So the loss of the faith community wasn't the only factor, but it seems to have removed a crucial safety mechanism right when the underlying economic pressures increased.
In states where the decline in participation was steepest, the increase in deaths of despair was the largest relative to previous trends. It suggests that when the support structure of the religious platform is removed, individuals lose an essential emotional and social resource for coping.
And it's not just for adults. The data on adolescents is also really compelling.
Research using rigorous methods found that religiosity provides adolescents with emotional resources to deal with unexpected life shocks, like a severe illness or the bereavement of a family member, in a way that participation in school clubs or general friendships simply does not.
So the deep communitarian benefits conferred by the platform are critical for forging emotional resilience.
They are.
It's fascinating, then, that these groups are so uniquely effective at bridging social divides while simultaneously maintaining high levels of segregation. That seems like a paradox.
It is the paradox of the religious platform model. Studies confirm that poor people are far more likely to become friends with better-off people they meet in religious groups compared to those they meet in schools, workplaces, or even their local neighborhoods.
So they're uniquely effective bridge builders, creating these weak ties across class lines.
They are, but then the segregation paradox kicks in among the wealthier members.
Ah.
Despite this capacity for social mixing, religious communities are often highly segregated by income. The affluent often intentionally self-select. They choose a church that is likely to have members just like us. Because the social obligation within the platform is so high, you are expected to be genuinely friendly and supportive of everyone.
So to manage this high cost of belonging, the rich choose to belong to platforms where the pool of potential assets already matches their social and economic status.
Exactly.
Let's move on to the mechanics of belonging, which is often less about what you intellectually believe and more about what you physically do. This leads us to the technology of ritual.
Ritual is an ancient and powerful technology for social bonding and organizational competence. When groups perform activities in synchronization, singing, dance, procession, prayer, it triggers natural chemical discharges in our brains.
Like endorphins and oxytocin.
Things that we find intensely pleasurable. It reinforces shared ties and identity, creating this deep nonverbal memory of surviving an experience together.
And the need for correct and repetitive performance, known as orthopraxy, has historically encouraged the mechanization of ritual. It's moving us toward a sort of automated spirituality.
Precisely. We see this with the Tibetan prayer wheels, which date back to at least the 4th century CE. By spinning the wheel, which contains thousands of written mantras, the action mechanically substitutes for the manual recitation of those texts, accruing merit through correct mechanical action.
And modern technology has just jumped right into this.
Oh, absolutely. Our sources detail the Acer Smart Prayer Beads, which are essentially digital counters. They track a user's mantra recitations and then tally the resulting merit that can be shared or even competitively displayed on social media platforms.
Wow.
And in Hindu traditions that emphasize elaborate, precise physical worship, there are examples like the robotic puja arms, developed with companies like IBM Watson, to perform complex, repetitive lamp offerings with perfect, emotionless consistency.
A robotic arm performing a complex, millennia-old ritual that is the divine economy, fully embracing automation.
And these mechanical aids are incredibly persuasive, especially in traditions that emphasize correct practice orthopraxy over correct belief, or orthodoxy. They offer the promise of graceful, unconscious mastery of the skill involved. The repetition of ritual, whether manual or mechanical, becomes the core persuasive act.
Speaking of persuasive acts, the fuel of these platforms is compelling narratives. Stories are central to all religions. But what makes a religious story so uniquely effective at capturing loyalty?
Effective stories, especially in religion, are often highly counterintuitive. They violate our expectations of probability. Studies show that people, when asked to predict the structure of narratives, overwhelmingly prefer those that develop slowly at the start and then accelerate quickly at the end. the surprise triumph.
Even though real life is just as likely to follow the opposite structure, with a fast start and a slow, gradual decay.
Exactly. And the sources provocatively label these stories optimism porn.
Optimism porn.
They provide far more sympathetic joy, that pleasure triggered by witnessing a cooperative partner's success, than real life typically affords. These emotionally charged narratives encourage cooperation, resilience, and learning, convincing us we are part of an immense, ultimately successful cosmic drama.
And what's particularly powerful is the paradoxical success of religious narratives focused on profound defeat and sacrifice. Why would a story about failure be a winning organizational strategy?
Consider the pivotal example of Hussein ibn Ali. In 680 CE, at Karbala, in present-day Iraq, Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, was attacked and killed alongside his entire family and a tiny bodyguard of just 50 men by a much larger force.
And this was essentially a political assassination designed to eliminate a rival to the ruling caliphate, Yazid Isfand, a power play.
Yes, by the standards of historical dynastic murder in that era, it was a sordid but otherwise unexceptional affair. It was a failure. But the religious platform of his followers transfigured that defeat and sacrifice into a world-changing, inspiring narrative. Hussein's martyrdom launched the 180 million-strong Shia branch of Islam, commemorated annually with profound intensity during Ashura.
So the platform took a military and political failure and turned it into the most enduring source of meaning and identity for millions.
It did. And this inherent capacity for persuasion seems almost hardwired into us. The sources suggest that skilled storytellers were evolutionarily favored.
Oh, how so?
Research among the Agda hunter-gatherers in the Philippines confirms this. Communities that possessed skilled storytellers were observed to be more cohesive, more cooperative, and simply more attractive places to live. And the storytellers themselves. They were rated as more attractive partners and had more surviving children.
So a profound, almost genetic taste for narrative was a guide to survival and to social status.
It seems so. But that capacity for massive persuasion, whether through ritual or narrative, creates a vulnerability to exploitation.
The dark side.
Absolutely. Narratives can be manipulated to serve interests other than the community's. Studies show that societies whose folklore portrays women as less dominant and more submissive tend to relegate women to inferior social roles. And while telling followers they will find redemption in defeat can be genuinely consoling, it can also be a powerful tool for leaders to persuade followers to make sacrifices that only benefit the platform's powerful elite.
This brings us to one of the most intellectually freeing ideas in our sources: the optionality of belief. We, especially in the Christian West, tend to think that intellectual belief must be the necessary precondition for joining a faith.
Right, that you have to believe first, then you join.
But the relationship is often reversed.
Belief is often a consequence of belonging, not the cause. The decision to commit to the community precedes the intellectual certainty. Consider Blaise Pascal's famous wager. Pascal was not arguing that a skeptic should try to conjure intellectual certainty. He argued for choosing to belong to Christianity, even if your intellectual belief was minuscule or non-existent.
He urged the reader to start participating in the practices, the rituals, the community life.
Yes, he urged them to travel toward faith by participating in the life of the platform first, knowing that the community, the rituals, and the shared narratives would eventually bring the emotional and intellectual certainty of belief as a social consequence.
The decision to belong is the action. Belief is the outcome of social immersion.
Precisely. And this helps explain the original practical function of creeds. We think of reciting the Nicene Creed as stating a theological truth, but historically it was a signal of loyalty.
How do you mean?
Historically, the recitation of creeds, like the Nicene Creed, used the Greek word symbolon, which meant a token or tally. It was like matching two halves of a broken object to verify identity.
So the recitation signaled whose side the believer was on.
A marker of factional loyalty, not a verification that the precise theological doctrine had been intellectually verified by the person reciting it.
So if I recite the creed, I am saying, I am one of you. I belong to this community.
It was a clear factional marker. If you look at theological controversies, like the millennium-long filioque dispute between the Eastern and Western churches, where the West added the phrase meaning and the Son to describe the procession of the Holy Spirit, this was less about establishing factual truth about the Trinity and more about marking a clear line of political and factional separation between Rome and Constantinople.
It was constructive diplomacy through subtle theological change.
You could say that. And it suggests that for most members, their beliefs often remain incompletely worked out. They accept the core tenets necessary for belonging without pursuing the radical implications of those beliefs.
And that capacity for compartmentalized thinking is the platform's great social safety valve.
It is. People hold beliefs that have profound consequences if they stop to think about them. But they often stop short of the remorseless working out of the implications of their beliefs in real-world policy or behavior.
The sources cite a truly tragic example of this compartmentalization in Ireland.
Yes, the horrific example of the Tuam Children's Home. The official Catholic doctrine at the time held that the soul enters the body at conception. Now, if this belief were fully worked out, it would imply a duty of profound respect towards stillborn babies and infants who died shortly after birth.
But the reality in those institutions was dramatically different.
The mother and baby homes, run by the church, operated under a culture of profound silence and shame. When the Tuam site was eventually investigated, the remains of nearly 800 children were discovered buried in a decommissioned large sewage tank.
My God.
Hundreds more were sent for anatomical research. This was a shared societal capacity for compartmentalized thinking, a widespread ability to simultaneously know the doctrinal truth about the soul and yet functionally ignore the inconvenient, horrific implications of that belief for the most vulnerable.
That structural ability to maintain radical beliefs while prioritizing social function over strict theological consistency is a powerful feature of the religious platform.
It allows the community to prioritize the loyalty and adherence of the individual, which is necessary for the platform's survival, over the often messy process of achieving private intellectual certainty.
Let's pivot now to the ultimate platform the religious organization interacts with, the state. We've seen the transaction legitimacy for power, but what is the ultimate long-term cost of that partnership?
In pre-modern societies, relations between rulers and subjects were often governed by consecrational principles. Rulers derived their authority because their power was blessed by God or the gods.
So rulers desperately needed this religious legitimacy to command obedience, loyalty, taxes.
And in return, they granted vast power to the religious movements: subsidies, tax breaks, legal authority, the original quid pro quo.
But the long-term cost, as Adam Smith predicted centuries ago, is enormous.
Political co-option, while granting incredible short-term stability and economic advantage, inevitably taints the religion as partisan. It makes the movement unable to appeal to a broad cross-section of society and critically shrinks its natural catchment area.
And if the political regime falls out of favor, the religious movement often falls with it.
Often catastrophically. The case of Ireland provides a textbook example of how a comfortable political relationship can shield an organization until the dam breaks.
Oh, so what happened there?
The Catholic Church in Ireland, particularly after the famine, established a centralized control project that eventually led to a powerful, formal political influence, solidified by the 1937 Constitution, which granted it a special position. This comfortable political relationship became the Church's shield.
A shield that prevented necessary internal accountability.
Absolutely. It protected the Church from criticism and allowed anger over decades of scandals, the existence of secret families of priests, rapes of children, the horrific levels of abuse in the mother and baby homes, and the systematic cover-ups to build up unchallenged and unaddressed.
And when the dam finally broke, the loss of legitimacy was tidal. What were the specific triggering events?
There were critical moments of collective recognition. For instance, the election of Mary Robinson as president in 1990, a liberal intellectual figure who won despite a government minister criticizing her as a wife and mother, signaled a massive shift in public opinion.
A shift against the established order.
Yes, and this, combined with the subsequent undeniable horrific revelations of abuse and the Church's complicity in cover-ups, had a catastrophic impact. The Church, by trading its core legitimacy for state power, lost both power and legitimacy in the long run.
Just as Smith predicted.
Exactly. The result was a massive sudden decline in public religiosity among Irish citizens, who finally had a secular alternative that resonated with modern values. It's a dramatic example of how a lack of competition ultimately destroys the organizational platform.
Okay, now let's contrast that with how religious movements function in a highly competitive marketplace, where there is no political protection.
High competition forces rapid, aggressive differentiation. When the barriers to entry fall, for instance, with the invention of the printing press in 16th century Europe, which democratized access to Scripture, the ecosystem just exploded.
The Protestant Reformation.
Exactly. Throwing off the yoke of Catholic orthodoxy didn't lead to one unified alternative. It immediately led to an ecosystem of doctrinally incompatible Protestant sects,
Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists.
all vying to divide the market into profitable, differentiated niches. They had to be more persuasive, more zealous, and more focused than the competition just to survive.
So, high competition forces, aggressive organizational innovation, and sharp doctrinal lines. What about low competition that isn't protected by the state, but by that community lock-in we talked about?
When a movement is protected by the strength of its community ties or by geographic isolation, it can afford to be highly uncompromising. Consider 19th and 20th century Christian missionaries in sub-Saharan Africa. They often made monogamy an absolute, non-negotiable rule for membership, even though it flew in the face of local cultural norms and deeply destabilized family structures.
And they could demand these massive sacrifices because they held a monopolistic position in terms of offering the path to salvation and the community resources.
They leveraged the strength of their platform. And this contrasts sharply with early Irish Christianity, which, facing a high competition environment in early medieval Europe, was more symbiotic with indigenous religion and organizationally flexible.
So they accommodated practices like polygyny for centuries.
They did, because strictness would have crippled its ability to attract and retain members in that highly fluid spiritual marketplace.
We have to address the dark side of community and trust, the organizational vulnerability inherent in these platform structures that allows for systematic abuse.
Yes, and the source is clear. Religious organizations are not uniquely abusive. Secular institutions like major youth organizations or other high-profile charities have similar issues, but the structure of religious platforms and the deep trust they cultivate makes them dangerously open to exploitation.
Why?
It's due to three key factors that are actually central to their success.
Factor one is the platform structure itself.
Yes, the platform structure facilitates intense, intimate networking. While this is overwhelmingly positive for community building, it is also a setting uniquely conducive to grooming. It encourages close, bilateral attentiveness between members, especially between a charismatic leader and a vulnerable follower.
Okay. And factor two is discreet communication.
Members share deeply personal spiritual matters with specific interlocutors, their priest, pastor, or religious guide. They opt in because of a spiritual need, which mandates communication that is discreet, if not secret, and highly intimate. And that expectation of privacy creates a setting ripe for exploitation without external oversight.
And factor three, the centralization of power in the charismatic leader.
The leaders possess both charisma, the ability to inspire and mesmerize, and organizational legitimacy, based on their ability to interpret and communicate the divine message. This combination inevitably leads to many private, intimate, and unsupervised conversations with members.
Right.
The observation about abuse in faith communities holds globally. The fact that a pastor or a rabbi who abuses is also often an acclaimed, highly charismatic, mesmerizing lecturer is the point.
Why is that the point?
Their charisma and their recognized authority bypass the normal critical defenses of the individual. They are viewed as both trusted and spiritually superior, which allows them to manipulate the platform's resources, trust, and intimacy for exploitation. It's the very mechanism that makes them successful in building the community that simultaneously makes them dangerously vulnerable to exploitation.
That structural insight demands ongoing vigilance regarding accountability and transparency within the divine economy.
Absolutely. It demonstrates why competition, as Smith argued, and external accountability are vital, because the organizational structure itself creates a powerful internal culture of silence and secrecy that protects the charisma of the platform, even at the expense of its assets.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize the adaptive genius of organized faith. What is the core conclusion about its organizational success in the modern world?
I think the core conclusion is that religion's survival is entirely due to its profound organizational adaptation as a competitive platform. It has defied the skeptics, the proponents of the secularization myth, because it has consistently focused on the creation of community.
On meeting evolving fundamental human needs for meaning, status, emotional insurance, and belonging.
That's it.
And now the competitive landscape is about to be shaken up again, perhaps as radically as the printing press did in the 16th century, thanks to technology.
It is. We could draw analogies between the spiritual worlds religion has provided for millennia and the modern idea of the metaverse. The metaverse is defined by offering an effectively unlimited number of users, a sense of presence, continuity of identity, shared history, and real-time communication. If you strip away the digital references, This experience, an immersive, continuous virtual world, is precisely what analog religion has offered its participants for thousands of years.
And now we have artificial intelligence entering the picture, potentially disrupting the core organizational product, the message itself.
The dramatic fall in information creation costs means that AI can now create plausible new texts, neo-scriptures, if you will,
Yeah.
that are highly tailored and persuasive to the individual user. Virtual and augmented reality also allow individuals to customize their own mystical or ritual experiences without needing human intermediaries.
This fall in information cost could be as radical a disruption to religious messaging as the printing press was to the medieval church's monopoly on scripture.
It could be.
So if the customized doctrine can be delivered flawlessly by an algorithm, does that mean the days of the human guide, the priest, the pastor, the imam are numbered?
I think we're more likely to see digital systems function as complements, not substitutes. We know that the dramatic fall in the cost of musical recordings did not reduce the demand for music. It dramatically increased the price and demand for live concerts.
Right.
Similarly, virtual, personalized religious experiences will likely increase the marketability and demand for the one thing AI cannot yet replicate.
Right.
Real, live, human religious community. The most innovative organizations will adapt the platform model to integrate these technologies, but they won't abandon the core human product.
So if you look toward the future, what is the single most valuable, non-replicable asset a religious platform can possess in an age of exponentially cheaper yet potentially less trustworthy information?
It is absolute verifiable trust within the community. When one of the authors asked a large language model, an AI, how a religious believer could tell the difference between true and false religious messages generated by AI, the LLM's main piece of advice was telling.
What did it say?
It said, seek input from others, talk to other members of your religious community, and seek their opinions on the message.
That is profoundly ironic. After all this technological upheaval, the core competitive advantage is something so profoundly analog: verified human trust.
The AI directed the user back to the organizational platform. In a world saturated with synthetic messages and bespoke spiritual offerings, the most powerful competitive advantage is not the charisma of the leader or the elegance of the doctrine, but the ability to find and belong to a community whose communication can be trusted.
A compelling and surprising note to end on. The future of faith lies in who can credibly certify that trust.